welcome to Look Down There, the show where we talk about all the things we don't talk about. I'm your host, Michelle Lamore. Today, my guest has a PhD in counseling education and is a bona fide sexpert. She's always willing to have the difficult conversations we need to be having, which is exactly why she's on this show. She has worked as a gender studies and counseling education professor and ran a halfway house for women in addiction recovery. She is also the creator of Revealed, a program that helps individuals find their power through sexual agency. Here she is with me today, Dr. Juliana Hauser. Hi, Dr.
Oh,
Juliana.
hi. It's so good to see you. I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you.
Yes, I'm so happy to see you. You know, we've spoken a few times in the past, and I just did something for your program, and you know, you've gotten to know a lot about me, but now I get to know more about you. So the tables have turned.
Great.
Yes. So you have a really interesting, varied background that's all kind of brought you to the path of pleasure. So I'm curious how all of those things have brought you to pleasure, or if that was always kind of your goal.
It was not my goal. I actually started off as a kindergarten teacher. So it was really been different. And I've taken a lot of kind of like just paths, but it has made when I look back, it makes sense. I was always drawn towards being curious, asking questions that other people weren't asking, no matter what field it was in. At first, I was really drawn to working with those who were women identified, and that was a lot of my focus. It's since then changed a lot. But I found that sexuality was something that was really coming up with almost every topic that I was entering in any kind of part of my career or education. And I also lived in LA for a while, and I was acting, and I found that acting was very similar to the study of psychology. It was the study of human behavior. You just used your insights differently. And that sexuality and pleasure was intertwined in that world as well as a lot of the teachings that I was in. So when I got to my doctorate program, and I had one class on sexuality. And for those who don't know this, that therapists don't have to have a class on sexuality in order to graduate or to be licensed, which is absurd. And we've talked about that previously. It's just nuts that that's the case. So I was lucky enough to be one of the few that got a class in it, and everything came alive for me. It was similar to when I transitioned from teaching to becoming a therapist. My first class, I was like, oh, these are my people who look at the world like I do. And when I had my sexuality class, it was the same thing. Like there was just something that came out of me. But it took a while for me to really infuse pleasure as a principle within sexuality because of, like all of us who weren't properly sex educated, pleasure wasn't in any way a part of it. It was something you came to on your own, secretively or in your relationships, but it wasn't anything that was being taught. But when that came together, it changed a lot for me. And I was like, oh, this is how we should learn about our sexuality in a societal way and in an individual way. And it became my passion to change that. First, I had to do it individually, and then I needed to figure out how to test it in courses and with my clients.
Yeah. And how was that process for you, like learning it individually? Because when we enter this kind of work, there is so much unlearning we have to do in order to learn and really confront our implicit biases and uncover these things about ourselves. How did that go for you? How was that process?
The first time that I had the reflection on me actually was in an acting class. And I knew my coach really well. And she had us all go, as we all were in the same class, and we had to build a level of trust week to week. And she had us go around in a circle and say, what would be the worst scene that you could have to act out? And I was like the second person to go. And I was like, oh, a sex scene. And then someone else looked at me, they're like, murder. The next person was like, incest. And everyone just kept looking at me like, why is that your scariest thing that you'd have to act out? And I did it so gutturally. So when everyone kind of went around, it was obviously which one of these was not like the other. She's like, so I want you to go seduce Price right now. And so she had me improv, which anything else, it truly would have been easy for me. But for some reason, it was really difficult. And so I tried to seduce him. I knew it was horrible. She said, "So how was that price?" And he's like, "Awful. That was terrible." And then she had another woman seduce him, improv. And she's like, "What was that like?" He's like, "Incredible." And she looked at me and she's like, fix that shit, Julian. Like, you've got to figure it out. And sometimes it can be brutal in that world. And so there's a brutalness to that. But in the follow up, where I came to in my own thought process was I was so in the performative world in my personal life, in my sexuality. And even though you would think that would translate to being performative and acting, because it wasn't a scene that was written for me, and it was actually me improving it instead of acting out someone's words and being able to hide behind that. But I had to have the audacity to be myself. I realized the disconnect was enormous. And when she said, "Fix that," and I started looking at it, I just really started looking at who I was authentically. And when I started looking at that, it just hit me like, oh, sexuality is really the essence of who you are. And it's an expression that is so removed for most of us that we're taught the wrong thing. We're taught that sexuality is sex and sexuality is who you're doing sex with. And when it dawned on me, it was so much more of sensuality and pleasure and an expression of who, like a form of me, not the purest, because there's just so much yucky stuff that's associated with purity and sexuality, but just the soul to soul part. That opened up a lot of things for me. And when that changed how I saw myself, how I interacted in the world, and how I connected with people inside and outside of sexual connection, I knew I had to bring that to other people too. It was a windy road, though. It was a windy road to pleasure and a windy road to the essence of me.
Yeah, it is always a windy road to pleasure. That's what I'm finding. We try all sorts of different ways. We try to deny it. We try to say we don't need it or don't deserve it or whatever kind of things we make up. But hopefully, eventually, we all find our way there.
Yeah,
I know it's.
And the next part of that too for me was that, and I forgot to say this, was that once I had those realizations, how pleasure and sensuality came to become pivotal in my own individual journey, and then I made it in teaching others, was that if I really wanted to connect with the truth of me, I had to become mindful. And pleasure and sensuality demand that you're mindful in the moment. If you're feeling pleasure, if you're experiencing pleasure, you're in the moment in experiencing that. The moments can be longer or shorter, but you're mindfully and you're truly connected to who you are. And I was always angry when I first figured that out. It's like, why did this take so long? And why is there such a distance between here and there? So anyway, I wanted to add mindfulness to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to pull it back to something you said about sexuality being the core of who we are, the essence of who we are. And I totally believe that. And I feel like, we have the most, well, I'll say I have the most problems when I'm not connected to myself sexually or with pleasure or sensually. And it is when I'm not mindful. And I have to go back to that. And it's so odd to me. I had another guest on, she's a menopause doctor, and we talked about the same thing. Like, these doctors, gynecologists, don't get any sexual education or like pleasure education, like none of it. And therapists as well. And it's so strange because this is such a core part of who we all are.
Mm-hmm. It is unconscionable and unethical that the people who we go to the most for help in our emotional and our physical well-being are not educated in any way, let alone in an evolved way that's helpful.
Why do you think that is?
Oh, well, I think it's the final frontier of self-development. And so our society just hasn't figured that out yet. I also think that it's so taboo and people think that it's divisive rather than inclusive. And that just feels too much. It's extraordinary when I seek out speaking at medical schools. The reaction I get is, it's as if we are talking from something from 500 years ago. I cannot believe it is still such a resistance. It's just like, ooh, no. I don't have time for that. That's not important. And again, I just think our society has made sexuality a luxury and not a necessity.
Mm.
And I think people like you and I are saying, no, 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 it's a necessity and we have to get it right. Look how many problems are a ripple effect because we do not understand sexuality.
Yeah, and all the different forms that it takes, like
Mm-hmm.
we think it's just like, okay, that's very heteronormative. Well, like there's so much more. There's so much more of a spectrum. And there, the people that did this, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, I mean, what pioneers? Like,
I
did they get
know.
everything right? No, but they were doing the work,
That's right.
and like
Yes.
doing work at even a more closed off puritanical time. And,
Mm-hmm.
as this country that we're in is very much trying to get back to that. So we're out here doing this work and having these conversations. And where are you based again? You're in
Oh, speaking of that, Kentucky. That's
right.
that's where I'm in the hotbed of that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was thinking. It's like, all of this work is really a lot more accepted on the coast, like New York, LA, San Francisco. But yeah, you're in the thick of it. So how is it
Mm-hmm.
for you to be in middle America doing this work?
Well, I don't mind it. I really, I feel like I'm in it. I'm in it where it needs to be happening. And I actually don't feel as isolated. I find the pockets of people who are supportive, but also my work is virtual. So I don't get it as much on the ground. And since I don't feel the resistance as much as it's in my professional life, as I would experience in a personal life. And it's interesting when people find out what I do locally, it's either the party trick or it's the piranha.
Mm.
And there's tons of judgments. And I know you know this too. When people find out what you do, they just automatically either tell you things that you're not asking, or they give you their opinion on what you're doing and what they think of what your profession is. And that's been an interesting road that hasn't been the case everywhere I've lived. And I lived in a bunch of places.
Yeah, it is something that I've actually been thinking about as I've been doing this training for intimacy coordination. Like it's a new level of people going, huh? It's
Yes.
like, it's not I hate the question, like, what do you do? Because then I have to decide, like, do I have the energy for your bullshit? I don't know, I'll, and I've, sometimes I'm like, yeah, I do burlesque because I feel like ruffling feathers. And other times I'm like, I do jazz dancing, like I don't even want to talk about this with you. And I mean, and this is like another one of those things. And now I'm like, oh, but I'm really interested in maybe being a sexologist or getting into more of what you're doing. And I'm like, well, that's just another thing. Like, it's like, how outside can I be?
Yes. It's so funny when you said that about what do I want to do today, and it'll be like when people ask me, sometimes I'll say a sex therapist, other times I'm a marriage and family therapist or an educator, and you're right. Like, do I have energy for what I know invariably is coming back at me, or do I not? And sometimes I think I do my best sex education on the airplane. That I'll be writing and things like, I know you're reading what I'm writing. I'm just going to teach you a few things right here in this. And the other time I'm like, no. I'm not, this is not open for discussion right now. I don't want to have to get into this. I just want to do my work and do it in that way. It's
Yeah.
not benign. I think the headline of that is like, our work is not benign. And some days that is beautiful. It doesn't matter where I live. And other days it's exhausting to feel like I'm always pushing the boulder up the hill. And so when I get to meet people like you, I'm like, oh, yeah, we're doing it. We're both doing this. And we're lighting the load for each other, or we're remembering why we're doing this. And
Yeah.
that's where my private practice comes into place, because I get to not just think and be like a thought leader in sexuality or in the media that's one-sided. I get to work with it and remind myself as to why is this important and how does this help people change people's lives individually or in their relationships. And that helps give me motivation too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're on the ground, you're doing the work, like you're connecting with people and you haven't removed yourself from that. And I think that's when we can get into issues. Like we don't remember what it's like to not feel comfortable with this subject, and
Mhm.
I find myself experiencing that as well. It's like, oh, you don't talk about that. That's right. Okay.
That's right. Yes,
Oh, right.
true.
So in doing this work, what is something that has, one, surprised you about yourself, and two, surprises you about the people that you work with?
Mm. So surprising me about what surprised me about myself. Um, in some ways, I'm braver than I thought,
Mm.
and that makes me feel proud that I can develop a thick skin, that I can forge into places where others haven't gone, or can have an endurance, perhaps, that I didn't think I would have previously. I'm not sure I would have predicted that I'd be this long in this field as well. And also that there are places where I don't have a thick skin, and
Mm.
that there's a vulnerability in sharing. Because I write a lot about my life, I write a lot about my thoughts, and so I share a lot, and sometimes that's the hardest thing for me to recover from, it the people who kind of know me and have pretty negative things to say about what I do in my work. Strangers, it doesn't bother me, but it's the people who know me kind of, that I'm surprised it still gets me, as it does. Not very often, but that's the case. um, about like the people I work with, or the world. And it kind of, because I work in different places for my clients, what surprises me is, truly that, because I hear lots of terrible stories, and a lot of what I do is just trauma, or it's hard things. But I'm always surprised and in wonderment, and feel so honored to have someone let me into their world, to their inner world. It is such an honor. And especially when someone talks about their sexual world, it's another level of vulnerability that always amazes me. It just feels beautiful. And the resiliency that people have been through shit. And when I get to be privy to their inside thoughts, I'm amazed by it, and I find that to be pretty wonderful. Conversely, it also is, it's so maddening when I come across, and not in my clients, but like in other kinds of work, the suppression of sexuality that is so harmful unnecessarily. Not that that's a surprise, we know it, but there are times that I'm like, what is the point? Like, what are you really fighting for? And your 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 points do not support what you're saying.
Mm.
And I kind of don't understand what people are really arguing about when the facts seem so clear.
Mm. Yeah. And sometimes they're only made clear by talking to someone like you, right? Because otherwise we're just stuck in our heads and we can't get out, and we don't have support, and there's no one to turn to. But
Mm-hmm.
I feel you on all of that stuff. And I love that you said being braver than you thought you were. That's really great. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I had people, especially like the people in my life who met me when I was in the kindergarten role, like, what? I would have never guessed. And I was like, exactly. That's how accessible sexuality is. That
Hmm.
if you had met me back there, where I was wearing, would I just look different and had a different way in the world? That's how accessible sexuality can be for all of us. That's how normal sexuality is. But it takes bravery when you can't go to some social outings, or you have people that assume so much. Like, will avoid me completely because they think all I talk about is sex. Which, first of all, who cares if I did? But,
I'm
but
like, yes, we're friends. I'm going to talk to you.
that's right. And it's brave. There's some conversations that have come upon me unexpectedly and uninvited, that it takes a lot of bravery to do as well.
Mm.
And I think it's true. And I think for people in my life, in my personal life, I think there's bravery of being in my life, and being around somebody who steps into this space is not for everybody. To be in a relationship with me, or to be in a friendship, or even some of my family members. My mother has gone from fainting when she found out I had sex for the first time, to she could talk about masturbation and self pleasure easily. And she's more unlikely to have made that transition than I was. And I think there's a lot of bravery in that too.
That is awesome. Way to go, mom. Yeah. And you never know what you're capable of until you really put
Mhm.
yourself out there and yeah, finding that new kind of confidence, right?
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah. So tell me about your program Revealed and how it helps to bring people to their power and find their sexual agency.
I love talking about revealed, and I found it's one of those things it is actually pretty difficult to explain. And I've been working for years of how to distill it down into even a couple of sentences. So I would say it's the combination of the philosophy and belief that your sexuality is the essence of who you are, and that sexuality is a key component to connection in your life in multiple levels, and having like a spiritual connection between both of those thoughts. And I use the word spiritual loosely. It's not religious based. It's just more like, if we're talking more worldly and philosophical, it's a marriage between the two. And it is a discovery of who you are through the lens of sexuality. And the vehicle is your sexual journey. So we look at from birth until where you are in life right now, we look at your sexual journey. And I do that with 10 pillars of holistic sexuality that I've made it to be. So that to me, holistic sexuality is defined in the concept as sensuality, health and reproduction, pleasure, desire, behaviors and practices, identity, sexualization, relationships and intimacy, love, connection, and then the hub of it all is the concept of agency, and in particular sexual agency. And within all of that, I have lots of questions. It's a very introspective course. I say that it's a journey, an individual journey that you experience collectively, especially if you do it in a group. You can do it individually, but I often do it in a group. It's in 8 countries, so I've really tested it cross culturally. I've done it with all genders, transgender, non-binary, male and female identified. I'm working to bring it into prison systems in California. I'm working with female clergy. It is looking. It's not sex education in the sense that it's tricks and tips. It's the sex education that teaches you the difference between luxury and necessity. We are really looking at who are you, and layer that with what is sexuality. And then finally, who are you as a sexual being, and how do you want to show up in the world with others? How do you want to connect with others?
Yeah. And that's just such a hard question in general. Who are you? And,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people will answer that question with what they do, right? They know what they do, but they don't know who they are. And again, it goes back to mindfulness. And yes, the marriage of spirituality and sexuality, like that's where I feel we've gone wrong. Like
Mm-hmm.
sexuality, experiencing sex, experiencing sexual pleasure to me is a very spiritual experience. And when I feel the most connected to like divine erotic energy, which is so powerful.
Mm-hmm. It is. And hard to assess, like to access for some people, or sometimes in our life or in some relationships. But once you've tasted it, even a glimpse of it in your sensuality, in your pleasure, or in a holistic sense of it, you can't unknow that. And so I find that once people have had a glimpse into that, that's when they come to me. In a lot of ways, you kind of have to graduate into Revealed. It's not a starter course. You have to already be thinking and doing some self-reflective work, and to realize there's something deeper. And for most people, sexuality really is one of the final places that they start looking. It's always there nagging at them, but they have a hard time finding where is an evolved way for me to really understand my sexual journey, and how does it, like we look at patterns too. So we look at the patterns in your life, how you're showing up to these relationships and to these connections, and what have you experienced. Part of it is I do something called like decluttering. So we declutter your sexual messages along the way also. Like, what were you taught from family of origin, from religion, from media, from the era and culture in which you were born? And what works for you that you want to keep? what needs to be tweaked and recycled and what needs to be thrown out. And that's a pretty important part of the process too, of ultimately that leads us towards an agency of deciding what is sexuality on your own terms. I used to call it be your own sexpert. Because I wanted you to become the own expert of your sexuality. It ended up changing into the name Revealed, because people kept saying that it just kept revealing more and more and more. A phrase I use in Revealed is, what do you need to say? What do you need to say? What story in your life is raising its hand for you to examine differently, from a different lens? And how does that fit into who you are and where you want to be heading? Which is, again, part of the decluttering of your messaging. And everything is based in the concept of agency, which is really the pinnacle of my career and a real passionate part of what I teach people. And agency is something that is, if you can get it inside the context of your sexual self, then you can get it anywhere else. And it's one of the hardest places to enact agency is within sexuality, which is why I love the intimacy coordination that you're doing, because it's based in agency.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. I'm curious if you think that we would have such a difficult, do you think it is our nature to have a difficult time connecting to our sexuality? Or do you think it is because of our nurture that we have such a hard time finding this in ourselves and accepting it?
I think it's nurture. I think it's societal. I think that we have a natural inclination to having our sexuality be a normal part of our life. I think how we have different access to that really depends on so many intersections, our race, our gender, our era, our culture, that get in the way of it. Because I think there has been times and there has been cultures that have a lot of access to their sexuality. And you see a lot of positive things in those cultures, as opposed to the ones who don't have access and try to limit it and take away people's agency towards it.
Yeah. Can you give examples of those cultures? Which culture?
Actually, way back, like in Greek life and Roman life. And I'm hesitant to say that. I actually almost gave the caveat, but yeah, you just picked up on it, which is we have to rely on how history has been written. And we know that history isn't always written with accuracy. But the premise of how the people who got to write the stories gave us was that there was a view of sexuality as being a crucial part of who you are and a crucial part of society. Instead of it being other than, it was actually relevant. So even if you're talking about like what we've learned in historical, that lovers were allowed to fight next to each other because they felt that the sexual connection that people had and the romantic connection actually would make warriors better. So having the identity of being gay and having a lover that's same gendered as you was viewed as a positive, as opposed to it being something that was awful and shameful and a harm to it. It's just one aspect of it. But I also think that we have discovered there's also an intersection with gender. So the societies that herald females, that allow there to be female leadership, that allow there to be a matriarchal way of organizing a culture and society as opposed to a patriarchal way, there is always the development of sexuality as a part of things. It is not as a weapon, it is a resource.
Sexuality is a resource, not a weapon. Yes. Yes. Oh my gosh. I was thinking about matriarchal societies this morning, like you do.
Sober coffee.
Yeah. Just like as I was journaling and I was like, wow, like what an amazing world it would be to live. Like, I can't even imagine. It's such a fantasy, and like really unpacking the patriarchy is so much work and so much effort. And I really, I've been doing this work for a long time, and I feel like I'm just now realizing how affected I've been by it and going, oh shit, it's like a whole other kind of spiritual striptease, and yeah, and just like removing these layers, like, oh, I don't need that. I don't need to feel this way. I don't need to be jealous or competitive or fearful, but this is the stuff that's just embedded in us and we don't even think about it. And then once you realize it, then you start seeing it everywhere.
You do. And then I think there's often a grieving process because we had this knowledge that we can't unknow, but we don't necessarily have the room to enact and to play with that knowledge. And that feels really frustrating. And it's really difficult until you find the pockets where you can play, or a relationship where you can flourish in that way. I'm curious, have you ever used that term before, spiritual striptease?
I call it spiritualities.
I love it. It's brilliant. I love it.
Yeah. Because I find that I've had to do that a lot. You talk earlier about seducing someone, right? Like, so that action of seducing someone is really vulnerable. It's very scary because you're, while you may not be naked, like it showing yourself to someone in that way is so vulnerable, right? And there's often like a lot of stillness in seduction. There's a lot of eye contact. There's a lot of breath. And that is really scary stuff, especially as a performer, because as a performer, you like to be moving, you like to be here and there. And like, and doing what I do, it's all about like inviting the gaze and giving permission, but it's not only about the invitation, it's about showing up to the party. Like I'm looking right back at you, So like, in order to do that work, I've had to kind of, I felt like burlesque has been a magnifying glass to, those like roadblocks, where you have to start examining vulnerability and anger and, guilt or whatever it is that's in your way and preventing you from really having that connection with people. And all the work that you've been doing since that day in acting class, ideally that it would have been a nicer send off into this work.
Yes. But, it's interesting because when I finally was distilling out what felt the most vulnerable, and I'm curious if it rings true at all for you and the work you do, I realized it felt very vulnerable to have the audacity to non-verbally ask somebody, do you want me? Do you want how I'm presenting myself? Do you want this part of me? And have it be one-sided, to not get a lot of feedback, to not get a response. And does that ring at all in your work, or is that a Juliana thing?
Well, I'm thinking about my work versus my private life, like for me, I think it's always easier to do that on stage because that's the safe space for it. Right.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, I think I've had to work really hard to find the confidence off stage as I have had on stage. So like what I relate to what you're saying in that way, like finding that that assurance and that confidence when you're not like under the lights and wearing sparkly, like you're not wearing the seduction outfit, right? Like maybe you're wearing some jeans and a t-shirt and like still being able to access that energy and those skills and like bring it forth. It's definitely is something that I've had to, acquire over the years.
Yes, I relate to what you're saying too.
Yeah. Well, Juliana, did I say it right? Juliana.
Yes.
Damn it. There's a girl that I work with at work. Her name is Anna. And so I'm like consciously going like that. So, okay. Juliana.
No big deal.
I love talking to you so much. I'm so happy to see you again. And thank you for spending your time with me here. Is there anything that you would want to add before we leave here?
I want to thank you. I really thank you for the work that you do and how you show up in the world. It's so important. It's always such a pleasure to meet someone else who is in their lane and they're in this space. So just thank you for persevering, because I know there are 1,000 untold stories that got you to this place. So thank you for that. Wanted to say that. And the second thing is that I do love talking. As much as we've joked about people talking to us in our personal life, when I'm in my professional lane, I love it when people connect with me. It's truly a passion and calling of mine. Sometimes I wish it wasn't so much of a calling of mine that I could ignore a little bit. But I love when people ask me questions. I love when people connect with me on social media or through my newsletter to find out what are people wondering, what are people needing. And so I invite people to connect with me in those places.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Thank you for the thank you. And I love all the work that you're doing. And we got to do something, you and I.
We will. I know.
Yeah, we got to connect in real life someday.
Yes, we will. I know we will. Mm-hmm.
Yes. You mentioned your, people messaging you, your newsletter. Where can people connect with you?
Mm-hmm. So my website is Dr. Juliana with 1N.com. And then on all social media handles, it's Dr. Juliana Hauser, Hauser.
Fantastic. And we can find all the information about Revealed on those platforms as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again so much for making time for this today. I know we are both so busy, so such a pleasure.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yes. And now everybody, it's time for you to spread the love and spread your legs and spread the love. What's the word? Yes, you know the catchphrase, spread your legs and spread the love. Tell your friends, tell your lovers, like, share, subscribe, follow, do all that good stuff. You can follow us here at I Look Down There or me at Michelle Lamore. And don't forget to follow Dr. Juliana as well and check out all of her great offerings and wisdom and love and knowledge.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes, everybody, remember that confidence comes from the bottom up. So grab a mirror and look down there. Until next time. Bye.